The Palm Beach Civic Association brings you Studio 33480, delving into key issues impacting all who live or work in the zip code for the unique island of Palm Beach. This program is sponsored by the Fortin Foundation of Florida. And now, our host.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tim Malloy with the Palm Beach Civic Association, and this is Studio 33480. Today, a very interesting guest, James Free. He's a Palm Beach resident part-time, a Tennessean, has a home in D.C., and was very instrumental in politics over the last, I would say, almost a half century or so. Nice to have you here, sir.
Good to be here after a half century.
Am I right on that?
About.
I'm going to call you Jim because you're a friend of mine. What is interesting with Mr. Free is a lot of things. He was very, very close with Jimmy Carter, very dear friend, and of course we just lost him, and we'd like to talk about that for a few minutes. And also he represented the music industry for many years in D.C., so there's some stories and anecdotes we need to share on that as well. Let's start with Jimmy Carter. How did you meet him? First of all, where'd you come from? I know, but tell the folks, and then how did you meet Jimmy Carter?
Born in a little town called Columbia, Tennessee, lived in Nashville, worked in Nashville, got involved in all this through that, an internship during college, and I met this great guy named Ned McWhorter. Ned went on to be the speaker and then became a very, very effective and popular two-term governor of Tennessee. Ned's my mentor of sorts. Anyway, with then Speaker McWhorter, we went to a meeting in Memphis in 1973, and it was kind of a tri-state party meeting, and one of the speakers was then the governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter. And the Democrats had just suffered, a devastating defeat with McGovern.
Right.
So they were frailing around about what do we do now, a bit like they are right at the moment, as a matter of fact. But the best speaker was Jimmy Carter because he's the one that said it's time that we learn to have partial influence over a winner instead of total influence over somebody who can't win. And McWhorter and I looked at each other and smiled and realized this guy had it, and then went on to develop that relationship with him and went to Atlanta and met him. And, of course, Carter was running for president.
Right.
So somebody as kind of popular and powerful, if you will, as McWhorter was on his short list to become friends with, and they did.
What is it about him? He's very different than any president, a very spiritual man. He was a nuclear engineer. He was a veteran. He was a peanut farmer, a man of the country. How did all those things converge to make this extraordinary person, whether you liked him politically or not? He was an extremely interesting guy.
He was always interesting, always knowledgeable. I mean, you want to talk about music, or you want to talk about nuclear engineering, or, you want to talk about World War II. He was just an interesting guy who, obviously had maybe done a little study on who you were, and, would carry on a conversation where you said, I want to know this guy better.
So when you walked in the room, he already knew something about you, or
sure.
he could take a quick take on something.
Well, he was a student.
Yeah.
He never quit being a student of music or anything else.
Is there a story that best defines him that you can think of? And that's probably many you've got, but his kindness, his bravery. He was tough too, right?
Oh, he was real tough, but he. One of my best descriptions of understanding him, I think Ambassador Young gave in his eulogy, where he said this guy was from two different worlds, but he, if you will, integrated in both of them. He was a white, very much, segregated part of the South in a county that was a majority black population county, but he was in both these communities and understood how to work with them and bring them together. And I think that was one of the great parts of his life in and out of the government was, trying to cure a problem, bringing people together.
I think I've shown you the picture. I interviewed him as a very young reporter from New York when he would not leave the White House during the Iran crisis, as you recall. So they sent a few of us down as pool reporters, and then everybody used the tape. So I walked in, I think, at 26 or 7 to the White House, the Oval Office, and there he was, one-on-one conversation. And I figured this is how naive I was. This is the warm old, good old Jimmy Carter, and he was so steely-eyed and carrying the burden of this for a long time. It gave me some insight into the fact that this is a multi-layered guy, and imagine his emotions at at that time. Were you speaking to him, or you were certainly aware of what he was going through?
Oh, sure. We were still, operating in public policy at the same time that was dominating everything in the news. But we were doing, the Alaska D2 Lands Bill. We were doing the Energy Bill. We were involved in all kinds of legislative initiatives at the same time. Right. You got to remember, Jimmy Carter. We all have these people. This Governor McWhirter was the guy in my life. The guy in Jimmy Carter's life was Admiral Rickover.
That's right.
Who was fierce and who demanded the best, and thus came the title of the book, Why Not the Best? That's where that came from. And Carter, you had to kind of understand how he grew up in the tutelage, if you will, of Admiral Rickover to understand him. He was as personable and down to earth as some guy from Plain, Georgia would be. But he was also steely-eyed, as you said, and very, very smart.
His post-presidency has been described by a lot of people, not by me necessarily, as the greatest post-presidency of any president we've had. He did an awful lot of good things. Let's take partisan politics out of all of it. That was just him, right? That was his mission.
I remember, there were several kind of, not retirement, but end of the White House gatherings of sorts. And at one of them, I think it was Bob Strauss, great guy from Texas, gave him a set of golf clubs. And everybody looked at each other like, what a waste of golf clubs this is. Jimmy Carter, and he says this, I'm quoting him, he said, ex-presidents have enormous power to be an ex-president. You still have that power, and you can use it to help people or enrich yourself. And he chose to use it to help people, and did.
We're going to get back to that, but I want to talk about your representation of the music industry for so many years. Explain that to me. You were their guy in D.C. on a lot of levels, and then I need to hear some stories about music people.
The music industry is a very complex, riddled with lots of different pieces of legislation that do copyright, trade, and everything else. And there are a lot of people in Washington that represent the music business, the RIAA, the music publishers, whatever. I was honored when I left the White House. One of the first clients I got was Broadcast Music Incorporated, which is a songwriters group.
BMI.
BMI. They collect the money from the venues that are using money and then distribute those monies to the songwriters that wrote the song. And at the same time, I was very honored to get hired by CBS. It was back when Mr. Paley was still head, and you remember everybody was trying to buy CBS. Right. Ted Turner made a run at it. Jesse Helms made a run at it.
Is that right?
Yeah, with the Congressional Club. So went to work on that, and while working at CBS in Black Rock, up there too many days a week during that period of time, I got to know the record company guys. Obviously, my Nashville beginnings kicked in. They kind of liked me and ended up doing a lot of work then for CBS Records, which became Sony Music.
You met virtually every big luminary in music, country music for sure. Or come on, music. Tell me a good story.
Well, I mean, when you've got a fuss going on with some other industry that might not be wanting to pay you for your music, you bring in your best talents, your best weapons, if you will, in congressional relations. And those were Gloria Estefan in some offices, and it was Charlie Daniels in some other offices. But I got to walk a lot of famous people around the halls of Congress. All new ambassadors present their credentials to a president.
Right.
And so you had, for the first time since before World War II, the People's Republic of China's ambassador in the Oval Office with his entourage presenting his credentials. And part of that kind of routine is at the end of the meeting, the president will always say, because a lot of these ambassadors probably won't see the president again.
Yeah.
The president will say to them, is there anything I can do for you? And the Chinese ambassador was a big fan of John Denver's. But they protected and kind of just let certain things in, and John Denver's
Rocky
music,
Mountain High was
it was very homogenous and not
yeah.
offensive or political, and so this guy liked it. So he said, I want to go to Nashville. And so the president went,
went to you, right?
Well, he had Susan Clow, his secretary, call me up in my office and say, "Get to the Oval Office now," and I mean now. So I ran over there and ran in there, and there was the president and vice president Mondale, and Zbigniew Brzezinski and Cy Vance and the Chinese entourage. And the president said, "This is my guy from Nashville. Jim, the ambassador, wants to go to Nashville." And I said, "Yes, sir."
So what did you line up for?
I went back to my office and called my friends in Nashville, Francis Preston, and the guy that was head of CBS Records back in those days, and the Country Music Association and the Grand Ole Opry folks, and put together just this great weekend. And went to the Grand Ole Opry, and he and Roy Acuff did the fiddle and the whole thing. But the weekend culminated with a brunch on Sunday. He was leaving to come back on Sunday afternoon at Tom T. and Dixie Hall's ranch. Tom T. being an artist himself, but another guy who was just a unbelievable songwriter.
Right.
Tom T. Hall had a TV show, I think.
Yeah.
And they hosted a brunch for the ambassador. And Tim, everybody in town came.
Yeah.
Minnie Pearl, Roy Acuff, John and June Cash. Go down the list. They were all there. I asked Minnie Pearl, months and months later, I said, everybody came. Well, I was so, it was wonderful and how proud I was. She said, "Jim," "it's like going to see somebody from the moon." Nobody had done that.
Connected much to China at that point.
So as the brunch got underway, Dixie Hall rang her cowbell saying, brunch is served. And at any other time in Nashville, Tennessee in 1979, there'd be a blessing. How awkward. It was a bit awkward, though, with this Chinese entourage. And from the back of the room, Johnny Cash and June started singing "Shall the Circle Be Unbroken." That was the blessing.
Stopped everybody. Wow. Which in its own way is a prayer.
A great memory. That's exactly what it was. Yeah. That's what it was meant to be.
That's a story.
Great memory. Great memory.
I should tell people who are watching this that there's a very good CNN documentary in which you're in it a lot, talking about Jimmy Carter, but it's about how the music industry was drawn to Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter really knew his music. Is that the case?
It is, and another story that's not told so often. I mean, he and Rosalind were, newly married, and he was in the Navy, and they didn't have two nickels to rub together. And one of the things they did for entertainment, they had a record player, and they would go out and buy records, but they would buy different records of the same song by different artists, and then would compare them and decide which version they liked the best. I remember he told us that story, and I thought, I would never do that, right? But he was into that kind of music. But yeah, and the linchpin here, when he got in the governor's office, he knew everybody in the business was coming to Atlanta to do a show, however big you were or whatever, or on the way, and he would invite those people out to the governor's mansion. In the documentary, it talks about Bob Dylan.
Yeah, tell me about that a little bit.
He asked Dylan to come to the governor's mansion, and Dylan almost gets choked up in telling the story about how when he met with this Southern governor, the guy quoted all of his lyrics back to him.
And Bob Dylan was a pretty reticent guy. He wasn't an immediate "I'll be there" kind of guy.
Loved Jimmy Carter.
Really?
Loved Jimmy Carter. And those stories about his kind of understanding and appreciation of music, I think helped make him president. He becomes friends with a guy named Phil Walden, who ran Capricorn Records, which was a back then a beginning young record label down in Macon, Georgia. But all of a sudden they exploded with, a group called the Allman Brothers.
Heard of them.
And the Marshall Tucker Band, and the list goes on, and it became this kind of Southern rock music that just exploded all over the country. And here's a great story. I mean, so Carter was running for president against much better-known candidates, some of whom had run for president before.
Right.
And he didn't have a lot of political money. But Waldron would do a deal with him where they would send the Allman Brothers into Detroit, and they would fill that thing up because the Allman Brothers were so, popular, and the kids all bought a ticket to come see him. The Carter campaign knew that they were going to get that money, that the Waldron was going to do the concert, and let everybody know that their money was going to Jimmy Carter, so it was all legal. But they would take the, $100,000 is what the room was going to make, and they'd go out here ahead of that. This is the part that's great. Ahead of it and buy TV ads, kind of, if you will, on the come, right? And then they would sell out the room, pay off their debt, and they'd go to another place.
Is that a Ponzi scheme?
No, it's not a Ponzi scheme. It's a great, never idea. Been used before, but certainly has since. The other good thing, they're at the end of the campaign. Jerry Brown was still in the race, and obviously was a worthy opponent. And some of the last primaries were out west, and there was one in Oregon that the Carter campaign decided they were going to focus on to see if they could beat him in his backyard.
On the West Coast, yeah.
And you might remember that Governor Brown was dating Linda Ronstadt. Yep. So he got Linda to go do a concert in Portland. Big smart way to raise some money for the Jerry Brown campaign. Carter picks up the phone, calls Jimmy Buffett.
Is that right? And Jimmy is Jimmy.
And so Buffett goes to Portland, fills up a stadium, and boom, they're even.
Wow.
And Carter won.
I imagine you knew Buffett, too. He was a local guy. At least we all consider him that.
I did. Played around to golf with him one day.
Yeah, as good as they get, huh?
Yeah, he's a great guy. A great humanitarian and just, invented a whole genre of music.
Yeah, he did. Country music artists, and Beyonce won the Grammy last night for Best Country Album.
Great.
Who's the best out there now? I mean, who do you like?
Chris Stapleton.
Chris Stapleton.
One of the best voices. I mean, Lainey Wilson. There's a lot of great singers, young great singers.
And country music's no longer about my dog and the train leaving the station, all that stuff that people make fun of. There's some beautiful writing going on as well.
It's always been the songwriting capital, Nashville. Trust me.
Yeah.
I mean, all that rock and roll stuff, a lot of it was written there. Yeah. A lot of Motown out of Memphis. I mean, Barry Gordy used to claim he was cousins with Carter.
No kidding. Detroit, Barry Gordy. Yeah.
And I think there was a great-grandfather that Miss Lillian was.
You were talking a little bit before we started about Tennessee booming these days, and Nashville is sort of the vortex of everything.
Everybody comes to town thinking they're going to be Elvis Presley, and most of them have that kind of talent. But along the way, part of the story, though, is that they will write a song, and that song gets covered, by Reba McEntire or somebody,
right.
And all of a sudden that guy or gal go, wow, I can make a lot of money being a songwriter. So they go into writing, I call it poetry, that you'll set to music. And so their kind of career changes. They're still an entertainer. They still can, entertain a room full of folks, just them, a mic, and a guitar.
Yeah.
But they've kind of dedicated their avocation, if you will, to songwriting.
Sort of like
Nashville's full of songwriters.
Yeah. Actually, through you, I've seen a couple of these really good guys perform their own stuff, which also played by amazing artists.
Yes.
It's like the old days when you go to Hollywood Boulevard to kind of get discovered as an actor or actress, you end up being a writer out in Hollywood. That's sort of the same thing, I suppose.
Exactly, but I mean, a lot of these folks are also. I mean, Taylor's a great songwriter.
Yes,
she wrote her stuff.
Bruce Springsteen says she's one of the best songwriters he's ever heard.
Yeah, but she's also
she also
pretty good
got everything else. How do you define a leader? Not compared to anybody today, but generally, what are we all? Because you've been around a lot of them. What do we look for, character-wise, leadership-wise, in people these days? If you were to create a leader,
want them to be really smart.
Yeah. Right.
You can't be dumb and be a real leader. You want them to kind of bring staff that kind of understand how to do that, and you want them to kind of map their plan out. You want them to understand where they think public policy needs to go. Carter, gets a lot of credit, and he deserves it. Senator Phil Graham was here not many weeks ago talking about that. Jimmy Carter deregulated more industries in the nation than anybody since or before. I mean, he deregulated airlines. Before Carter deregulated airlines, not everybody got to fly. But when the competition got into that airline business, all of a sudden you get JetBlue and Southwest. He deregulated trucks. Go ask Fred Smith in Memphis what deregulating trucks and airlines did for a little company called FedEx. And as Senator Graham said, it's one of those pieces of legislation that still bears great economic fruit. That deregulation and those industries continue to grow. All trucks back then were kind of family owned, and they were monopolies.
Right.
He deregulated trucks.
Right. So you've been witness to an awful lot of big things, but you spent some time at Camp David at one of the biggest things that ever came out of Camp David. Talk to me about that.
Well, it's still in place, the Camp David Accords. I mean, the fact that he got these two leaders that had fought a terrible war, mainly over the Sinai Peninsula, not very, very long before. And he got them to put their guns down, if you will, and come to Camp David and try to come to some peace accord. And people know this and hear about this, but the thing that most people don't remember or understand, which is still true today, is that Israel and Egypt have the two biggest equipped armies in the Middle East. So to have them put their guns down against each other and have that peace still be with us almost 50 years later is, I think, beyond significant. The other great international affairs thing that still lives on today is the normalization with the People's Republic of China.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the biggest, most populated country on the planet, and to us, they weren't there. They were totally an enemy. And, Carter said, this is not right. And, his predecessor, Nixon, had already kind of started to melt that ice by that great historic trip that he made to China. So it was there to do if somebody would take the chance to take it on. And, of course, there's going to be a lot of opposition to this. But, Carter got that done. He put more acres of land into public parks than anybody, including Teddy Roosevelt. He did the Alaska D2 lands bill. And I got a great story.
Tell me.
He wanted everybody to be for it and worked it, and it was tough. And obviously, the Alaska senators weren't too keen on this because they had economic interest in Alaska that did not want to, take any acres of land away from mining or stripping or whatever. And so Senator Ted Stevens, a great guy, smart guy, kind of asked to come down and see the president about this Alaska D2 lands bill. And so Senator Stevens comes down, and Carter has a map about the size of the Oval Office, and he rolls it out on the floor, and he said, what's bothering you? And Stevens knew, and there was this one section that was going to be part of taken into the park system that he wanted left out, and gave all the reasons why and da-da-da-da-da. And Carter said, but the problem is that back up here on this part of the mountain is the kind of the beginning of the river that produces the best salmon fishing in the state. And if you mine that, the tailings of that will kill that waterway. Stevens' chief of staff was a buddy of mine. He said that they got in the car and headed back up to the hill and got halfway up there, and Stevens turned to him and said, "Damn, he knew more about my state than I did." That's what you want in a leader.
You bet. Anything else? How you liking Palm Beach?
Palm Beach is great.
I know. I wish you were here more often.
Palm Beach.
We're here a lot, though.
Palm Beach is great.
All right. Jim Free, thank you very much for Studio 3348. We will talk to you soon.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Studio 33480 is brought to you by the Palm Beach Civic Association and our sponsor, the Fortin Foundation of Florida. We welcome your thoughts on how our program can best serve our members and residents.